On a quiet afternoon in the spring of 1923, Zelda Fitzgerald tucked a small handwritten letter inside her ballet slipper. She'd been practicing for hours, sweat trickling down her temples. Her feet ached unbearably, and her mind spun with daydreams that seemed to have no place in the dazzling parties and the swirling cigarette smoke that now defined her life. That letter, never mailed, was addressed to a childhood friend back in Montgomery, Alabama. In it, Zelda confessed she felt like a stage prop, glamorous from afar, but hollow and unreal up close. The letter was discovered decades later in a box of old keepsakes, a silent witness to her private longings and hidden sorrows. It's a detail many people, even devoted fans of F. Scott Fitzgerald and the Jazz Age, have never heard. And it sets the tone for the story of a woman who spent much of her life dancing at the edge of greatness, only to find the stage she stood on consumed by flames, real and metaphorical. The name Zelda Fitzgerald rings a faint bell for some. She was the vibrant, free-spirited wife of novelist F. Scott Fitzgerald, and as rumor has it, the inspiration for many of his most memorable heroines. While the Fitzgerald name evokes images of glittering 1920s parties, champagne toasts, and the restless spirit of the Jazz Age, the deeper truth of Zelda's life is both more haunting and more beautiful than any fictional flapper in her husband's novels. She lived in an era swirling with changes, social, cultural, artistic, and found herself both at the center of that whirlwind and tragically on its margins. Though not a Hollywood star in the classic sense, Zelda was an emblem of the glamorous, creative world that extended far beyond movie sets. She became a symbol of a generation's triumphs and pains, a living embodiment of the lost generation that roared through the 20s and fell silent in the 30s. To understand Zelda Fitzgerald, we have to picture the time in which she blossomed. The 1920s were a carnival of shifting values, especially for women. The stifling constraints of Victorian morality were loosening, and women like Zelda, bold, outspoken, and eager to explore, suddenly had a chance to define themselves outside the usual domestic roles. While Hollywood was churning out silent films that dazzled audiences with new cinematic tricks, New York was becoming the epicenter of a cultural explosion. Jazz clubs stayed open until dawn. People thronged to Broadway shows that challenged old sensibilities. Prohibition was on, but speakeasies flourished underground. Writers, actors, dancers, musicians, they mingled, argued, fell in love, and fueled each other's creativity in a frenetic dance. This was the background hum of excitement that greeted Zelda when she met the young writer who would become her husband. Born Zelda Sayre on July 24, 1900 in Montgomery, Alabama, she was the youngest of 6 children and known early on for her flamboyant personality. Her father, Judge Anthony Dickinson Sayre, was a well-regarded figure, serious and reserved, while her mother, Minnie, had a more romantic spirit. By all accounts, Zelda felt stifled in her small-town environment, longing for adventure and independence. She loved dancing from a tender age, performing cartwheels and acrobatics on the lawn when guests visited, ignoring scoldings that young ladies shouldn't behave so wild. From the beginning, she treated life as a stage, eager for movement, applause, and the thrill of the spotlight. Yet beneath that extroverted bravado was also a keenly observant mind, storing up glimpses of the people around her, capturing the mannerisms and rhythms of Southern life in a way that would later feed her writing and art. She met F. Scott Fitzgerald at a country club dance in Montgomery in 1918. He was a dashing young man stationed at Camp Sheridan, waiting to be deployed to the battlefields of World War I. Tall with a magnetic sparkle in his eye, he spotted Zelda on the dance floor and was entranced by her vitality. Zelda, for her part, noticed a certain poetic sadness beneath his confident bearing. It didn't take long for them to become the talk of Montgomery society. Zelda's rebellious streak and Scott's charming ways drew both envy and censure from the local aristocracy. After Scott's discharge from the army, the war ended before he could be sent abroad. He returned north, determined to make a name for himself as an author, and coaxed Zelda to follow. Though her family had reservations, she was determined to live a life that promised excitement and fame. Their wedding in April 1920 took place just a week after the publication of Scott's first novel, This Side of Paradise. Already the young couple radiated the success and glamour that would soon be magnified by the Roaring Twenties. They became the darlings of the literary world, and soon newspapers touted them as the golden couple of the Jazz Age. But this was no storybook romance, at least not behind closed doors. While Scott's literary career soared, Zelda found herself cast in the role of Muse, endlessly interesting to others, but rarely given space to develop her own artistry. She dabbled in writing essays and short stories, some of which were published under her husband's name or jointly credited, painted vibrant scenes that reflected her unique perspective, and pursued ballet with a fierce intensity. Yet the spotlight remained on Scott. Behind the public's fascination with their parties and soirees, an undercurrent of tension began to take shape. One lesser-known moment that reveals Zelda's unquenched artistic aspirations took place during a brief sojourn in Saint Raphael, a small town on the French Riviera, in 1924. While many accounts focus on Scott's writing of the great Gatsby during this time, Zelda quietly spent her days sketching local scenes. She found inspiration in the way the Mediterranean sunlight lit up the rocky coves. In a letter unearthed decades later, she wrote to a friend about her longing to find a color beyond turquoise for these waters and a shade deeper than rose for the sky at dusk. Her drawings, sadly, seldom made it to publication or gallery walls. Even so, a few pieces survived in private collections, hinting at an imagination that could have matched her husband's literary flair had she been given more room to flourish. The Jazz Age soared with Charleston dancing crowds, bathtub gin, and a relentless pace of social gatherings. Zelda and Scott were right in the thick of it all, from Manhattan to Paris. They clinked glasses with Ernest Hemingway and other members of the lost generation, forging bonds that were tempestuous and occasionally destructive. The Fitzgeralds spent money as fast as Scott earned it, traveling between grand hotels and plush apartments. Their relationship was a complex dance of devotion, jealousy, creative synergy, and acrimonious fights. Zelda, with her signature wit, once quipped that being a Fitzgerald meant forever needing to find a new horizon that's at least 3 times bigger than the one we just left. But that horizon always seemed to remain just out of reach, no matter how many parties were thrown or how many addresses they changed. The real heartbreak of Zelda's life began to crystallize in the late 1920s, when her desire to establish herself as an artist became a source of friction between her and Scott. She poured herself into ballet training, despite being considered older than most aspiring professional dancers, and even moved to Italy briefly to study with noted instructors. She spent up to 8 hours a day in the studio, punishing her body to achieve perfection. Friends whispered their concerns. Was Zelda pushing herself to the brink? But she wouldn't be deterred. This single-minded focus brought her a rare sense of personal identity, separate from her husband's shadow. Yet the strain on her marriage grew, as did the exhaustion and mental stress. Scott resented how dance took her time away from him, and how it disrupted their usual social swirl. During these years, their rose became legendary. Some of their friends found these battles, public, raw, and loaded with resentments, disturbing. On one notorious night in Paris at a dinner with fellow writers, Zelda was said to have thrown herself down a flight of stairs in an attempt to upstage Scott's conversation. Whether she truly meant to harm herself or simply sought dramatic effect remains unclear. The incident, however, rattled the circle of expatriates who had grown accustomed to the Fitzgeralds' outlandish fights. Shortly afterward, Zelda had what was described as a nervous breakdown. Modern psychologists might characterize her behavior differently today, recognizing signs of mood disorders or clinical depression exacerbated by a life of constant upheaval and intense pressure. In 1930, Zelda was diagnosed with schizophrenia, a diagnosis that might well have been inaccurate by modern standards. She spent time in various clinics and sanitariums in Switzerland and later in the United States. Scott, meanwhile, wrestled with his own demons, alcoholism, financial instability, and writer's block. The rapturous parties of the 1920s had given way to a far harsher reality in the 1930s, the Great Depression. Publishers were less eager to bankroll lavish advances. The public's appetite for jazz-age decadence had soured. Scott's popularity waned, and Zelda's mental health struggles became a recurring crisis they couldn't control. A rarely told anecdote from Zelda's stay at the Prangins Clinic in Switzerland: she befriended an older nurse who, after lights out, would let Zelda paint quietly in the recreation room. At the end of her stay, Zelda gave this nurse a small watercolor of a moonlit garden, inscribed with a heartfelt note: "Even the night has flowers, if you look carefully." Years later, when that nurse passed away, her family found the painting lovingly preserved. Zelda's sincerity and imaginative flair shone through even her darkest nights. Yet outside the clinic walls, the world often dismissed her as merely F. Scott's troubled wife. The tragedy is that these glimpses of her talent rarely had the opportunity to bloom fully. Zelda's writing career flickered to life, if only briefly, when she wrote her semi-autobiographical novel, Save Me the Waltz. She penned it during a feverish burst of creativity while hospitalized. The novel, published in 1932, recounted her deep love for dance and her tumultuous marriage under the guise of fictional names. Critics were lukewarm, and Scott was furious. He felt she had pillaged their shared experiences, the same raw materials he was using for his own novel, Tender is the Night. He forced her to revise parts of it, leaving Zelda deflated and more convinced than ever that her voice would never truly be heard or respected. The novel never reached the prominence of Scott's works, but for Zelda, it stood as a bold, if pained, assertion of self. Controversies and debates surround the Fitzgeralds to this day. Scholars and fans alike argue over how much of Scott's female characters, like Daisy Buchanan from The Great Gatsby, were drawn directly from Zelda. Some critics, especially in later decades, have viewed Zelda as the real creative force behind certain passages or ideas in Scott's stories, pointing to diaries, letters, and remarks that strongly echo in his published works. Others maintain that Scott was a singular literary genius, and while he borrowed from his wife's life, that was par for the course for a writer of fiction. The question of co-authorship has never been resolved to everyone's satisfaction. Another debate centers on Zelda's mental health diagnoses and the possibility that, rather than suffering from a fixed psychiatric illness, she may have been a casualty of the stifling gender expectations and creative frustrations of her time. As her mental health challenges progressed, Zelda spent increasing stretches in sanitariums and mental health facilities. The golden couple who once danced on tables in New York's Biltmore Hotel was all but a memory. By the late 1930s, Scott had moved to Hollywood to write screenplays, struggling to pay for Zelda's hospitalizations. Their relationship, already frayed, sagged under the weight of separate lives. They wrote each other letters, some heartbreakingly affectionate, some bitter and accusatory, and the distance between them grew. Zelda's daughter, Frances Scotty Fitzgerald, became a bystander to her parents' ongoing turmoil, shuttling between family friends and schools. An overlooked personal detail: in one of Zelda's final letters to Scott, she included a small pastel drawing of two figures holding hands by a river, their backs turned toward the viewer. She noted in the margin that it symbolized their younger selves, gazing at a promise she still believed might be just around the bend. It's an image that resonates with anyone who has ever watched the best parts of their life slip away. Though bitterness dominated many of their exchanges, this tender moment suggests that Zelda never truly gave up on the luminous dreams they once shared. The final tragedy, the one that sealed her reputation as the burnt Muse, came years after Scott's death. In 1948, Zelda was back in the Highland Hospital in Asheville, North Carolina, undergoing treatment and therapy. She was locked in a ward on the top floor, reportedly awaiting electroshock therapy, when a catastrophic fire broke out. The flames spread rapidly, trapping Zelda and several other women. The locked doors and barred windows turned the ward into a death trap. By the time rescue workers managed to penetrate the smoke and inferno, it was too late. Zelda and 8 other patients perished. Identifying her remains required days of painstaking efforts. The official cause of death: asphyxiation and burns. She was 47. In the aftermath of that devastating blaze, the world seemed momentarily shocked into remembering who Zelda Fitzgerald had been. Newspapers ran brief obituaries, many of them focusing on her as the wife of F. Scott Fitzgerald, the tragic half of a once brilliant couple. Yet for anyone who had read her letters, pored over her paintings, or listened closely to her stories, Zelda was more than a footnote to her husband's brilliance. She was a passionate artist trapped in an era and a marriage that rarely allowed her the freedom to soar. She was a woman whose flamboyant exterior masked a tender, easily bruised soul. And she was a reminder that the roaring glitter of the jazz age often came at an enormous personal cost. So why does Zelda Fitzgerald remain so historically and emotionally significant? Part of it is the romance and tragedy of her life. People have long been drawn to the glittering illusions of the jazz age, with its gin-fueled parties and unending search for novelty. The Fitzgeralds were, for better or worse, the faces of that generation, icons of an era that came crashing down with the Great Depression. Yet beyond the romance, Zelda's story stands as a cautionary tale of unrealized potential, societal constraints, and the tangled interplay between creative partners. Her life beckons us to think about the roles women have been asked to play, and how often their own gifts are silenced in the process. Her legacy also speaks to the cruelty of the mental health treatments of her time. Zelda's repeated institutionalizations might have offered more support and less stigma if she had lived in a different era. The same fire that eventually took her life was an excruciatingly literal reflection of the burning spirit she carried, a spark that was repeatedly contained, tamped down, or trivialized by those around her. Today, mental health advocacy groups cite her story as an example of how creative brilliance and emotional vulnerability often go hand in hand, and how neglecting that vulnerability can lead to disaster. Zelda also influenced countless women who recognized themselves in her longing to create and be recognized in her own right, rather than remain overshadowed by a partner. Modern novelists, playwrights, and even Hollywood scriptwriters have revisited her life from fresh angles, aiming to give her the spotlight she was denied. Biographers continue to unearth letters, diaries, and old interviews that shed light on her unsettled imagination. More than that, some of her artwork is finally being displayed at galleries and literary festivals, allowing audiences to see what she saw, a world both whimsical and fraught with yearning. When we look at the arc of her life, from the carefree Alabama girl cartwheeling in the grass to the haunted artist locked in a sanitarium ward, there's an unmistakable sadness that lingers. Yet we do ourselves and Zelda a disservice if we only focus on the tragedy. The fullness of her life also included rebellious laughter, spontaneous acts of kindness, a thirst for beauty in every corner of the world, and a fierce, if tumultuous, love for the man who became inseparable from her destiny. She offered an intensity of being that few could rival, and in her own small, determined way, she tried to carve out a creative path that might nourish her soul. Today, older audiences who remember the legend of the Fitzgeralds with a certain nostalgic reverence might feel a twinge of regret that Zelda's name wasn't always spoken with the same respect as Scott's. Younger generations discovering her life for the first time may view her as a feminist pioneer, someone who reached for dreams that her era was ill-prepared to accommodate. In either case, Zelda's story endures because it holds up a mirror to the illusions of fame, marriage, and creative ambition. It shows us what happens when a deeply sensitive individual is both worshipped and dismissed, glamorized and ignored. So here we pause with the image of Zelda dancing in a quiet studio, performing a pirouette that's witnessed by no one except her reflection in the mirror. That moment, unrecorded by paparazzi and unmentioned in the society pages, might have been among her happiest. A fleeting instant of freedom where her body and mind were synchronized, unbound by her husband's deadlines, her doctor's diagnoses, or the public's voyeuristic gaze. That's the Zelda Fitzgerald the world often overlooks, the woman who found, in her own private corners, a spark of genuine self-expression. And when we talk about her now, when we explore the remnants of her art, read her letters, or even just think her name, we keep that spark alive. Hers is a legacy that asks us to value the fullness of a human being, to question the illusions we build around genius and madness, and to never forget that behind every public myth is a private soul, longing to be understood. And that's all for today's video. If you like this video, hit that thumbs up, let us know your thoughts in the comments section, and subscribe so you won't miss out on future uploads. See you next time.